Hello, everybody, and welcome to What Would Jane Do, where we take a light-hearted look at contemporary problems through the lens of our favourite author, Jane Austen. And I'm joined, as ever, by Katie Macfarlane, who is,
Hello.
Katie, for those of you who are looking at this on YouTube, is splendidly dressed, as ever, because Katie spends much of her time doing, well, what would you call it? Recreation?
All sorts of things, really.
Dressing up.
Yes, I suppose you call it reenactment when I'm with a
Reenactment.
historical group,
Yeah.
and just dressing up and having a great time when I'm wandering around somewhere like Chatsworth and visiting their tea room.
Oh, yes, wonderful photographs from last year. My name is Julia Golding, and as well as having a doctorate in the period of Jane Austen, I also have written novels on the same subject. Right, so today we are going to say on guard because we are going to tackle the theme of what would Jane do about dueling. And I warned Katie that I was going to bring my sword. So I have actually brought my sword.
Excellent. That looks
Um,
like a cavalry sword, Julie. Are we doing this mounted?
Yes, grab your horse.
It was not
Uh,
unknown to have mounted duels, in fact. I thought of them to place mounted.
yeah, so we're going to be talking about Jules, all the various versions that were available because we tend to think it's only the pistols at dawn one, but
Mm.
actually there were other sorts available. Um, and have a look at what the sort of modern equivalent is and what we can learn from that. And I think it's quite, as we were saying just before we came on air, it's quite a nice alternative to following modern politics to think about dueling.
Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed.
Okay, so let's first of all start with what was the law on duels at the time? Katie, have you had a chance to look at this at
I
all?
have. Well, a little bit. And it's interesting actually because a lot of people, I think because of the books they read and the films they see, tend to think of duels as a Regency thing, and that was the only time it happened. But there have been it actually evolved from medieval combat and jousting and tournaments. And so back in medieval times, um, it the, it actually has a Latin word. It's derived from duellum, meaning a war between two people. And in medieval times, the right of a nobleman to defend his honour gained universal acceptance, probably coming out of the rules of chivalry, to be honest. So a knight threw down his gage, and people think of that as a glove. It could be a glove or it could be a hat. It's just symbolic. And the idea was your opponent picked it up as in yes, I'm accepting this duel. Um, this challenge rather. And the interesting thing was, obviously, at that time, the people most likely to challenge each other to duels, noblemen, were all trained in combat. You had to be, that's how you got power. So they would all be trained with swords, maces, pretty violent stuff. If you still think about men in armor, um, and that evolved into jousts and trials of combat in a more formal way, but it could still devolve into just bloody battle and people settling scores, even though it was supposed to be chivalrous. And then that changed suddenly, quite rapidly, because if you think about it, you weren't going to challenge someone, or you shouldn't challenge someone who's less able than you. So generally, the people challenging each other in medieval times were both skilled in combat, and it was a bad idea if you were inexperienced in combat to challenge someone who obviously knew what they were doing. With the advent of gunpowder, that was suddenly a massive leveler, and someone who was quite weedy could challenge somebody who's very experienced, and they could both kill each other quite happily. They didn't necessarily go into a duel wanting to kill each other, but it was this idea of honor being satisfied, and that's quite interesting. So there's a record as early as 1650 of two people fighting each other with guns, and then it's generally accepted between 1770 and 1870. So that's quite a large period, about 100 years, isn't it? Two men armed with pistols faced each other across a field, a remote field, usually not a field in the middle of town necessarily. And it's, as I mentioned, it's not all on foot. There's many accounts of people fighting each other on horseback. And then when a horse got shot out from under you, as often happened, they jump off the horse and start attacking each other with daggers and swords. And it could just turn into a massive melee. Um, But in 1808, which is our period, two officers got into an argument and within 20 minutes had challenged each other to a duel. One officer killed the other, and then he himself later got hanged because obviously he'd killed a fellow officer and taken him out of the regiment. So the consequences were severe, but as ever, if very high ranking people got into a duel and actually got found out and accused, they could usually get their way out of it. They weren't necessarily transported as a poorer person would be. And duels happened amongst the poorer uh, um, people because lots of us, if we think of a duel, we think of two very well dressed men in top hats fighting each other. It was just the upper classes. Obviously, what would happen is the only duels that would ever get reported would be of the celebrities of their day or the upper classes getting into trouble, which everybody liked. Um, of course, duels happened in the lower orders, but they were more likely brawls, uh, not necessarily fought with swords or. And if they were shooting each other with guns, it was more likely no formal rules. You just shot somebody you didn't like and would have got hanged for it. So it was
So
formal.
the officers you were mentioning, were they penalised under military law?
Yes, they would have been. I mean, they probably got into a fight in an officer's mess. There would have been people observing it. They couldn't let that stand because obviously all chaos would break down. And the laws at the time governing discipline in the army were very strict and to our eyes almost horrific. But if you considered the rough types, you were either sort of given the chance sometimes of transportation or joining the army. They had to be absolutely strict to keep people under control. And the women who followed the army were subject to exactly the same discipline as the men. So it's lots of floggings going on. But you didn't want to actually take your soldiers or your officers particularly. You think of how much training and how much skill some of the officers had, and that was absolutely vital to winning a war. You didn't want somebody going around taking out your officers, um, especially at peacetime, when they were so needed in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars.
So for the people who were not in the army, duels were theoretically illegal because
Yeah. Oh, they were illegal.
uh,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm saying theoretically because it's
Yes.
one of those laws which wasn't always prosecuted.
No, absolutely.
And we'll look at some cases where that's an absolute flagrant um, uh, situation. But it's seen as murder because you're
It is
shooting with
murder.
the
Yeah.
intention to kill somebody. Sometimes,
Sometimes.
yeah. I mean, but we'll look at the nuances in a minute. And obviously, it seems to be very much against Christian morality.
Yes, the
Because,
church did try and stop duels
yeah,
even from the medieval period, but they just went on regardless.
I mean, the obvious things it's breaking is the idea of you turn the other cheek, and um, there's no value placed on honor
No.
in the Christian morality. That's not other than honor your mother and father, but that's putting honor to somebody else. It's not your own honor.
No.
You're supposed to be humble.
Mm.
So there we go. So you've got a common practice which is used as a way of settling quarrels,
Hmm.
which is illegal and is in clear conflict with what most people profess is their religion. So, interesting grey area in society. But let's talk about how they happened and where they happened,
Mm.
consequences. So, this is what I know.
Okay.
I know that there was a formality to a duel, which is different from just getting in a fight down the pub.
Yeah, absolutely.
It has an element of being prearranged,
Hmm.
throwing down the gauge, offering a written challenge. There were different ways of doing it.
Mm.
And it was important that there were witnesses.
Yeah.
So you have your seconds, which is usually someone you trust, a good mate who
Hmm.
comes along and will attempt to negotiate a settlement prior to the thing happening. They're also technically supposed to step in and take your place as your second in some circumstances, but
Hmm.
they're also there to kind of monitor that it happens fairly. Um, Very often, they would have a surgeon on hand or somebody ready if they thought there was a high chance of um, injury.
Wounding. Yeah.
Yeah. This is the pistol version of this. I'm not sure what they
Yeah,
did about
yeah,
sword, because I think swords you can stop a bit earlier. Um,
yes, you can.
First blood or whatever.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and you would go somewhere because it's illegal. You would go somewhere where the authorities weren't patrolling. So, as you said, you went to a field somewhere. And if you remember, let's think about London, for example. London is surrounded by fields, places which are now urban were at that time not. So
Yeah,
Marylebone,
Hyde
Battersea,
Park. Yeah.
Hyde Park. So you had relatively easy access, and they usually happened early in the day at first light.
Yes, yes. I mean, hence pistols at dawn, isn't it? It's a classic for a reason.
Yeah. So that's what I know. So can you tell us, give a sketch in some of the more the details you mentioned? There were horse mounted ones. You mentioned as well that
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That was what distinguished a duel from a brawl. Is there were some set rules that people agreed on. It was a matter of honor and protecting your honor, and possibly usually protecting the honor of somebody else. So a man could fight a duel on behalf of a woman. A woman could fight a duel on behalf of a man. In fact, there was actually a record of in 1721, the Comtesse de Polignac and the Marquise de Nesle fought for the right to be the mistress of the Duke de Richelieu. So you can have
oh, they're French. I mean, these
yes,
French
that's
are
French.
wild.
And on that subject, it was well known for national characteristics that French were incredibly fond of fighting duels, as I think Marilyn Monroe stated in her song. There was a joke going around at the time that if two Englishmen were stranded on a desert island, they would soon start gambling. If two Frenchmen were stranded, they'd start a duel. That speaks to our national
Oh, it's
characteristics.
still funny.
Yes, it is. I love little anecdotes like that. Yeah. So, contrary to popular belief, I think your average duel at the time would probably be two men facing each other at an agreed distance rather than back to back and walking off and then turning and firing. The guns were inaccurate enough that you didn't turning and firing, they would have just gone all over the place. And even standing at a prescribed distance and firing at each other, chances were you might not hit. I think the chances were with smoothbore weapons, which didn't have rifling down the barrel, probably about 100 yards distance to hit something, and it could just veer off in any direction. So even if you were quite a good shot, um, you may still not hit your target. Men were allowed to stand sideways, and there's accounts of people buttoning up their jackets, not wearing bright coloured buttons, so it made less of a target. Um, and yes, there would be surgeons present because the chances of your survival depended on you getting medical treatment very quickly. And as you mentioned, people would try and stop duels happening if they possibly could, and try and arrange for the quarrel to be sorted out as soon as possible. Sometimes a really bad quarrel went on for months before the duel actually happened, with both sides trying to come to an agreement. Sometimes they blurted up out of nothing. Usually, the people were drunk or quarrelsome nature, and could be decided in minutes. Let's go outside. Uh, but the main thing was that there were rules. It was about honour, sensibly. Although plenty of people probably pressed a quarrel on somebody for many reasons. But there were few observers. You didn't want lots of people to know about it, and you would go somewhere, hopefully, where it wouldn't be noticed, at least until after the thing had happened.
And you were expected to withstand just one shot.
Yes, well, in the case of some duels, as I say, in the case of others, you might fire off your shot and then carry on with with swords and daggers, depending on your opponent and what the quarrel was.
I think
But
that's one of the areas where the seconds were
yeah,
involved, which is after the shot, they would say, are you now
are
satisfied?
you satisfied? Yeah, yeah. And hopefully
And
the guy would say yes.
yeah. And it wasn't like the medieval trial by combat that the person who won was regarded as innocent. It was more a proof of your manly courage that you were sticking by your principle, so you
Yes,
therefore
exactly.
put your life at risk. So the outcome didn't prove anything,
Not really, no.
in a way, other than that you really
You
meant
meant
what you
you
said.
meant it. I know. And that's quite it's a strange concept really to us these days. Concepts of duty and honor. but plenty of people might have called themselves honourable and acted in a less honourable way. There are plenty of records of people not being very honourable at a duel. Um, but in the case of Jane Austen, there's only
Oh,
one mention.
no, no,
Oh,
no.
oh, are
We're
we
not
not
going
allowed to
there yet.
say? We're not
No,
going. Damn, damn.
we're no, we're holding on to that because I
All
want
right
to
then.
actually stay in the world of real duels.
Real duels. All right then. Real duels.
Um, because there are some fascinating things still to
There
talk,
are. Mm,
which is we've begun to touch on the fact that it's very much bound up in a sense of primarily masculinity. That
yeah.
Cardinal Richelieu example, I think, is unusual. Women, no doubt, had their duels in other ways, on the whole,
Hmm.
um, be it presentation of self in certain places and cutting people, that kind of stuff. Cutting, as in snubbing, not getting out
Yeah.
alive.
And
Um,
and they were seen as well. It was seen as the weak sex, and they were supposed to be genteel and ladylike. But they could be just as ruthless as men, and women did fight duels, and there's even records of women fighting men in duels. One of my favourites was 1792 London. Lady Braddock was attending a party with Mrs. Elphinstone, and for some reason, nobody knew why, Mrs. Elphinstone had some quite cutting remarks about Lady Braddock's age and beauty, and that resulted in them being called out and fighting in Hyde Park in London. Um, and Lady Elphinstone fired a bullet through Mrs. Braddock's hat, which is fighting talk. If you're talking about bonnets, and then they took up swords. And eventually, Lady Braddock inflicted a wound and declared honour satisfied. They both curtsied and left, and that was it settled. I love the fact they curtsied at the end of it.
yeah, yes, I think this is I mean, this is the other way. In a way, it's an example of passion and anger being allowed to
Hmm.
find
An
an
outlet.
expression outside the legal system, but it's also a way of keeping a packet round that, to holding it in so that you've got
Hmm.
laws through which a kind of code of honor through which enough is enough pointed.
Exactly. And one of the code of honors which interested me was that duels were supposed to be only fought between equals in
Yeah.
in stature. So you weren't supposed to basically challenge somebody who was at a clear disadvantage in status to you. So I thought, well, okay, what does equals mean? Well, is it just a duke can only challenge a duke? And not necessarily. So if they're gentlemen, they're allowed to challenge gentlemen and recognize the gentleman. So merchants, bankers could challenge each other, and if they were of a gentlemanlike nature, they could probably challenge somebody of higher political status or rank.
Yeah, it's you probably had to have an instinct for who was in your class.
Yeah.
Talk about 3 examples of no, 4 examples, in fact, of famous duels at the time.
Mm,
So I wanted first of all to talk about the duel of Sheridan and Captain Thomas Matthews, which happened
mm,
in the 1770s. So this is around when Jane was born.
yeah.
What was different about this? It happened in Bath. Sheridan was making his way up through the sort of theatre world at the time. It
Hmm.
was fought with swords, and it was fought twice, which is quite unusual. The
It is.
first
Yeah.
time, it was fought because Matthews had insulted the woman who was to be eventually Sheridan's wife, though I think he also rather fancied her. She was a singer, a famous singer at the time. It's like fighting over Beyonce. It was that kind of. Um, and Sheridan won the first bout, but Matthews wasn't satisfied. This is the point of this, and demanded that they fight again, even though he was the one who'd offered the insult.
Mm,
And at the second bout, Sheridan was actually very seriously injured. It was touch and go. But he pulled through and he married the lady. So who he then had an acrimonious marriage with. That is the same. That's a shame.
that's
But
another story.
if you ended it there, it's a happy ending.
Yeah.
But you can see there they're using swords which they've both been trained in, and it's the classic thing. We're fighting over a woman.
Hmm.
Then the next one, which is infamous in the period, which falls in, I think, 1809, which
Mm,
is the Canning and Castlereagh
mm,
um, fight. This was about um, a disagreement over the conduct of the war, more or less.
hmm.
And what happened there was Canning, who was from a bit of a lower class than Castlereagh, but also in the government, so sort of level pegging
That
them.
status was level, yes, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Two government ministers were settling their differences by trying to shoot each other, which, it does raise the eyebrows a bit. But what is worse is right at the end of, well, after Jane's gone, in 1829, you've got another duel, this one between the Duke of Wellington, remember him,
Mm-hmm.
folks,
Yep.
but this time his Prime Minister, that's like the head of our government, he fights the Earl of Winchelsea in Battersea, which was Fields at the time, over what is called Catholic emancipation. It's including Catholics in public life.
Mm.
So if the Prime Minister is doing something illegal, then it really just showed the law wasn't really worth very much. And it was reported in the newspapers and nobody
Mm.
arrested.
Mm.
Nobody died, obviously.
Thankfully.
But it was regarded as a bit of a shrug. Oh, well, fine, that's what they do. And then final one I mentioned four is, of course, we mustn't forget America, which was following very similar codes of honor. And the most consequential one has had huge ramifications, not only in revolutionizing the world of theatre,
Mm.
because it's Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. So Hamilton's life and his son's life is cut short very early in Duels, which shows that this was going on in America. And you could argue that that changed the course of the American nation because Hamilton was out of the picture far too early. So duels are they exist in this grey area. You could approve of them, you could disapprove of them, but people did them all over the place.
Yes, absolutely.
So now we're allowed to turn to Jane Austen. You were about to say about her. How
Yes.
many duels appear in her novels?
Well, hopefully people are not going to shout at our podcast, but I think really there's two mentions. One is the supposed duel that almost happens off stage with Colonel Brandon and Willoughby. And then there's the mention of a duel of Mr. Bennet going to London to fight Wickham by a very worried Mrs. Bennet. And that's about it, really. I don't think Jane Austen would have known of duels, but I don't think she ever witnessed one or necessarily. It was almost too dramatic to bring into her more everyday retelling of stories. It was almost too romantic, and I think she was almost the antidote to the very gothic novels going on at the time, although she poked a bit of fun at them.
I think they need to look at both of those in context. So when Colonel Brandon says what he did over the seduction of his ward, does
Eliza,
it
yeah.
in a very sober way.
Mm.
And he hints without saying exactly, but there is a sense that they met and satisfaction was had, that
Hmm.
his honour demanded. As a
Yes.
sickly gentleman, it sort of goes with the territory that maybe this was. Nobody says, "Oh gosh, how terrible of you to challenge
Mm.
to a
Mm.
duel." It passes as a very serious note that Willoughby's been taken to task for what he's done.
Yeah, it shows the seriousness of the situation that somebody as level-headed and not at all quarrelsome appearing as Colonel Brandon took it that seriously that he felt he had to
Yeah,
resort.
it's
Uh,
like an inevitable. I had to do this,
yeah,
so that it was wrong. But when you look at Pride and Prejudice, which is like the next book along in
yeah.
terms of publication history, um, the one who's talking about duels is Mrs. Bennet, who's obviously not the most level-headed people, and she is talking nonsense. She is saying Mr. Bennet will fight him, and she's getting in a flap, basically.
Yes, yeah. She's getting hysterical
Hmm.
about it wasn't impossible to happen. It could have happened, but it was very, very unlikely to happen, especially with Mr. Bennet, who is not portrayed as a very fire and brimstone kind of guy.
No, I mean, one could imagine
Hmm.
perhaps Darcy and Wickham fighting a duel over his sister.
Hmm.
That wouldn't be beyond the
No,
realms of imagination, but Mr. Bennet has shown no activity in that area, shall we
no
say,
activity
up
other
to
than
this
just
point.
ending up
Yeah.
in his study. Yes, he's far more likely to give him a good telling off and and try and reach some sort of understanding with him, because he would have been very aware, as most people were aware. And the whole point about duels being secret is, if it got abroad, his daughter was already embroiled in a scandal. If he'd fought a duel, the scandal would have been horrific and nationwide probably.
There is a possibility that one of the reasons why Wickham keeps dodging being in the same room as Darcy, it's not said, but it's possible that he doesn't want to present Darcy with the chance of demanding satisfaction.
Mm.
Darcy isn't going to do that because he doesn't want Georgiana's
Name sullied.
yeah,
Yeah.
because if people start asking why are you fighting, it might come
Mm.
out. So there's a reticence on that part of him, but it is possible that's part of his motivation for making himself scarce.
Mm.
Um, and I think the other thing that Mrs. Bennet is talking nonsense and sense, because she says she'll he'll fight Wickham and he'll die, and then Charlotte Lucas will move into my house and we'll be out on the street and brother.
Yeah, she's returning to her eternal worry, isn't she? Everything goes back to, we're all going to be on the street if your father dies, and that is a very real worry.
Yeah,
So you can't laugh at that if you really, really think about it. I think that's the thing, why a lot of people don't really get Jane Austen, or think it's just, oh, it's all just bonnets and romance and people going to each other's houses. There are very real uh, worries underneath it all, that you could be facing destitution, poverty. Where are we going to go if somebody turns us out of the house? It is a real worry and it is a concern. So much as you laugh at Mrs. Bennet, if you really start to think about it when you're older, you think, actually, she's not actually that wrong to be
yeah.
worried about what happens to them all.
I mean, Jane is never. She's very. She never has one view about her characters. I think she's
No.
aware that there is a basis on which Mrs. Bennet is making this, and I think she's pointing out through Mrs. Bennet running through the consequences, the ridiculousness of someone, a family man like Mr. Bennet, the irresponsibility of a family
Yeah.
man like Mr. Bennet, doing this over the seduction of a daughter, because it will probably entail far more problems.
Mm.
After all, Mr. Wickham is in the army. He's trained. One
He's
sense,
much younger.
yeah, one sense is Mr. Bennet probably does very little shooting on his estate. Prefers his library. Um, so I think that Jane herself is part of that movement of thinking, is this the right way of settling quarrels?
Yeah.
So I think she's wondering about that herself as
Mm.
she's imagining her own characters trying to settle things that way.
Mm.
So she's not condemning them because I think it was so ubiquitous. It it was,
Yeah. That's just what some people did. Yeah.
yeah. But if you had a conversation with her about it, I think probably she would have seen the hypocrisy of it as well, with the fact that it's basically trying to murder somebody.
Mm.
I don't
And,
know. What do you
and,
think?
and yes, I don't have very much patience with duels myself, in terms of, I think there's better ways to settle an argument than possible death. And the thing was, a lot of duels were for very trivial natures. You didn't like somebody's outfit, or you just got drunk and got quarrelsome, and then before you knew it, you were too far down the line of challenging somebody and probably regretted it the next day. So I think it's an argument taken to extremes, and there ought to be better ways to sort arguments before it gets to extreme. And particularly at the time, there was I think somebody estimated, out of the 200 duels he'd either heard about or witnessed, you had a 3 in 1 chance of survival, which is not great. Or no, not 3 in 1 chance of survival, 3 in 1 chance of not actually getting killed. Um, so those aren't great odds. But generally, yeah, if you were at all sensible, you'd slightly wound somebody, or do something to ensure that your honour was satisfied, and you didn't actually have to take it to extremes. But yeah, for myself, I wouldn't be. I'd find a better way of fighting a duel.
Yeah. So I think it only makes sense while everybody around you is agreeing. And as soon as somebody says, hang on a minute, this is a
This is a bit stupid.
crazy way of thinking. When I was writing my book, The Persephone Code, which is
Yep.
in 1812. One of the things that are happening is that one of the bad guys is trying to persuade the father of the main character to fight a duel with her lover, Jacob, who's her sort of detective partner. And there's a confrontation in the park where the bad guy is saying, "Come on, you got to fight for your daughter's honor because she's living
Mm.
with this man."
Yeah.
And Dora basically says, "Why? You're an
Yes,
idiot. I
exactly.
mean, my
My
father has
honour. Right.
basically abandoned me long ago.
Yes.
His honor isn't engaged. I'm not bothered. So
Mm.
stop being so stupid." I mean, in 19th century language,
Yeah.
she kind of pricks the bubble of this because
This
her
notion. Yeah.
yeah, her partner Jacob is getting all ready to sort of fight for her, and that because he's from the military background, and he like Colonel Brandon thinks, "Oh yeah, I got to go and protect my lady," and
Hmm.
she's just saying,
I don't need
"Crazy,
protection.
yeah, I don't want this. Why is either injuring the person I love or killing my father a good outcome here?"
Mm,
You know.
exactly.
Um,
It's never going to be great, is it?
so it is the moment. I mean, that's what progressively happens over the 19th century. Whereas you can have the Duke of Wellington fighting a duel in 1829. You can't really imagine that happening in 1889. It may have in a rare occasion, but it would seem very outre by then, very
Yeah,
strange.
I think as the century wore on, and I think particularly with Queen Victoria
Mm.
on the throne, she really didn't like duels. And I think with the royals as usual, sort of leading the national vibe, she was furious with her politicians who were constantly fighting duels and basically getting in the way of actually doing the work of the nation. So I think she was like the stern mother saying, "Will you please stop this? This is totally unacceptable," and reinforce the laws, I think. So she was a big influence on stopping dueling happening. It still probably happened on the continent and happened. There's stories of students in Heidelberg into the early century giving each other dueling scars as a sort of mark of honor on the cheeks. It was like a badge of, "Hey, I've been to Heidelberg. I've got dueling scars on." But I
Well,
think
there may, of course,
it
still
petered
be
out.
people doing it to this day. I mean, I'm
Oh
not
yeah, we don't know because it's secret.
and it's illegal. So, the part of what we do and what would Jane do is think about Jane's perspective and then bring it into the modern day. And so
Mm,
I was thinking, what is our modern equivalent? How do we satisfy our honor, if such a thing exists?
mm. Do
What
we have honor anymore, Julia?
do we?
Is such a concept even thought about as it was then?
Well, certainly some of the things which they fought over.
Mm.
So let's say the
An insult to your friend or an insult to your
yeah,
wife or husband.
I don't. People may, I think, flare up.
Mm.
Maybe just as likely to get into a scrap or
Fight.
something
Oh
like.
yeah.
But you wouldn't have a formalized way of negotiating that. I think that you might end up see you in court kind of thing.
Mm.
I'm going to send my lawyer to you.
Oh,
So
very much so.
yeah, if you're in dispute with your neighbours, you don't say, "Oh, I'm
Yeah.
going to meet you on the common and we'll shoot each other." You say, "My, we're going to, I don't want to talk to you. My lawyer will be in touch." I mean, I think we tend to move it sideways into a sort of legal frame now. But the honour aspect, I can think of times when some of these more sorry to be a bit crude, but these dick measuring men out there in the world of very rich billionaires
Mm.
who kind of want to prove they're the toughest guy. There was that ridiculous thing, wasn't there? Was it Elon Musk and uh,
Probably.
the guy from Facebook? Didn't they say they were going to have a battle?
Did it actually ever happen though? I doubt
No,
it very
no, no,
much.
no. But there
No,
was some sort
exactly.
of we're gonna have a scrap, and
It's
there's
these
been
days it's my yacht's bigger than your yacht.
yeah. But I'm thinking about when people have actually fought, and of course
Yeah.
there were some influencers,
Hmm.
non-professionals who've done boxing matches and fought um, to sort of prove who's the biggest. But that's not the same as honor.
Not really.
That's just like a kind of competition rather than saying you've insulted my wife or my girlfriend or
Well,
whatever.
it's the fact that they are likely to do this in front of a load of people or broadcast it means it's not about honor, it's about ratings, isn't it?
Yeah.
or
Oh, that's our
perceptions.
modern era. What would
It
Jane do
does.
about ratings? Yeah.
It's
So,
it's a very, very different mindset.
mm,
So I think there are yeah, still people out there with honor, but it may be not called that. It's maybe called morals or standards or something like that. Um, and I think people are less used to violence, some people anyway, than they used to be. So vi- essentially in a civilized society, you shouldn't have to resort to violence. Now, I would say the veneer of civilization over us is very thin. We're a lot less
yeah.
civilized than we like to think, definitely. And you can see that in how quickly a relationship breaks down if there is an argument. Um, but generally, I would say people don't automatically grab a pistol or a knife if things go wrong. They're more likely to actually back away, or just grumble about it. They don't actually take it to the next level. Now,
Yeah, and
some
I
people
think I
will
think
do. Mm.
the legal system is stronger.
Yes,
So if you did
definitely.
say, "I'm going to meet you at dawn with pistols," then people would definitely say, "Hang on a minute, that's
I'm
really
calling the police.
that's wrong. I'm calling the police." And there is a police to call.
Yes, there is, and that's another good reason. Is it how enforced the laws were back then, how easy it was to see yourself as above the law if you were in a certain state of society. And I would argue that there are definitely rich billionaires who definitely see themselves above the law and prove it on a regular basis. So who isn't holding them to the laws of the land? But for the average person, no, there are laws there, and they would step in. And we're far more visible. We're far more packed in. Everybody knows everybody else's business. Everybody broadcasts their own business on social media 24/7. So it's very difficult to actually keep a secret like that without somebody else finding out about it.
So I think what would Jane do about dueling? She would be relieved to find it's not so much a problem.
Not
Have
so
actually
much.
managed to kick to the curb. So I think she'd be
I
relieved.
think people have dance battles now. I don't know if
I
that's
think
a
she might
better thing
enjoy
or
that.
not.
Every
Yeah,
savage can dance.
Regency dance battle. That's what I'd like.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you. That was, we wanted to talk about duels because of particularly highlighting the element that it wasn't just men fighting duels. And you will find in your Regency romances that there are loads of them. They pop up all the time.
All the time. Everybody who's anybody had to deal. And the source of a lot of my information was this book called Pistols at Dawn by John Norris, which is a very great source of information for any authors wanting to insert a duel in your book. There's and again, what I love is history is always far stranger than fiction you could ever dream up. So do your historical research, and you'll come up with some fantastic little gems of incidents.
Perfect. Now, we also were going to talk today about sort of Jane Austen news. And one of the big pieces of Jane Austen news in this 250th year since her birth
Hmm.
is that the BBC have put on an adaptation of the, is it Jill Hornby novel Miss Austen,
Yeah.
which is currently on TV. I've watched all of it. You've watched a couple of episodes.
Mhm.
So, what do you think about this story? I mean, for those of you who haven't caught up with it yet, the novel is about Cassandra Austen, Jane Austen's older sister, beloved older sister, who was the one who basically curated her memory, shall
Yes,
we
that's a good
say,
way of putting it. Yeah.
including destroying some of her correspondence, we think.
Mm.
And the novel works out the circumstances or imagines the circumstances in which this happened, but also with flashbacks to the two of them as youngsters together.
Mm.
So, what did you think?
I really liked it. Obviously, I'm biased because I love Jane Austen and all things Jane Austen, and I also know a little bit about her story. So I was interested because I felt that if you didn't know anything about Jane Austen, weren't that interested in it, the first episode might have been a bit slow because it is literally Cassandra coming to a house where somebody's dying and basically wandering around the house looking for an opportunity to do some scouting for letters, and that's about it. Um, the second episode picked up a lot more, going back into their youth. I really like the characters. I like the casting. There were some wonderful Austen-esque dialogue and moments of people sort of treading all over each other's feelings or not considering other people's feelings at all. There was a lovely moment where Cassandra reads out aloud from Persuasion to the bereaved niece, and the niece is hoping for a happy ending, and Cassandra is trying to say, "Well, that's not real life," but the niece was saying, I'm having a crap life. I want a happy ending." I thought that yes, that spoke for a lot of romance readers out there. Um, but no, I think the characters are very well drawn, and I really like the casting of Jane Austen, because she, if this was a Hollywood version, she would have been some feisty, beautifully made up young lady, and she had in this one she had a lovely face that was quirky, intelligent, but not ostensibly beautiful. But I really liked that character, and she came across as not abrasive or aggressive or feisty, but certainly intelligent and not one to take situations lying down, and somebody to challenge her, Cassandra. And she also came across as somebody who wanted the best for Cassandra, as Cassandra wanted the best for Jane Austen. They both, that relationship was very nice.
Yeah, so anyone watching this, I say definitely persist, because I think
Yeah.
it really begins terribly. Uh,
Mm,
it breaks the first rule of screenwriting, which is don't tell somebody the same thing twice.
yeah.
So Cassandra gets a letter, and she says, "Oh, I've got a letter from so and so. So and so is dying. I must go." Then the maid comes out, and she says, "What's happening, mistress?" And she says, "I've got a letter." I thought, "Oh, crikey, come on!" I know that there is a worry in TV executives that they have to explain things.
I really, really hate this idea that you have to dumb everything down. It's like, why have we suddenly become stupider? There's more knowledge than ever at our fingertips. Why have you got to assume that we have the understanding of a lima bean or something? It's ridiculous.
I
And I
mean,
think that the more
the
you
job
try
could
and
have
dumb things down, you just get the audience you deserve.
the job could have been done by Cassandra or Keely Hawes, isn't it? Wonderful casting. She could
Mm.
just read the letter,
Mm.
reading the letter, and she can go into the house and say, "I must be off."
Leave some mystery, for goodness sake,
Yeah, and then you're
writers.
there,
Leave some mystery. What's going on? That engages you far more than saying, "Oh, I've got to do this annoying task." Oh, well, that's all right. We know what's going on then. If you have a
Right.
bit of mystery and you think, "What? Why is she so upset? What's going on?" And also, Cassandra in that first episode came across as somebody you wouldn't actually like very much. She's
No,
like
she kind of
pushing her way into a house
yeah.
of death, having been told not to turn up, and she goes anyway. And you think, well, that's a bit off, what? And it's not until later you realise what she's actually trying to do. But
So
even so, she's very pushy about it.
there were a couple of things that I didn't like as choices, but they're legitimate choices. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, one of the villains of the piece is James's later wife, Martha,
Mhm.
who is played. I know it doesn't mean they necessarily liked each other, but she's played very
Very
negative.
much as a villainess, isn't she?
Yeah.
Yes, it's a bit of a horrible person. They even I love this little tiny detail. They had a flashback to when she meets her husband to be, and they're trying to sort of pretty her up for him, and they put sort of rice powder on her cheeks, and they put it in such a way she almost looks like a clown. It's almost like taking off her
Yes.
cheeks. So I don't think you would have done it in that way at all. But there we go. They wasn't
But
trying to make her look stupid.
it's a legitimate choice.
It is, yeah.
Didn't like it. And the other thing is, you might not have got to this yet, but there's a strong suggestion that Jane Austen was a depressive
Mm,
in the period after, particularly after her father died,
mm,
and it was played in a very modern way,
mm. Yeah, I don't like
and
that.
it it's legitimate, and there's nothing to say that people didn't
It
have
wasn't. Yeah.
time, but I wasn't. It's not part of my mental furniture about Jane Austen.
Mm,
I don't feel it's anyway, I didn't agree with it, but I know
no.
that's the writer's choice, and it's entirely legitimate. You can read that into
Yeah.
gaps in the I mean, I do this all the time, so
Yes.
I read loads of things into the gaps of history, so,
Mm.
my hands up, mea culpa. But I didn't enjoy that part.
No.
Um, the bit of it, I try not to spoil the plot, but there is a thing that happens in the last episode, which is so ridiculous and so that stupid that it is what brings a happy ending together.
Mm. Is it
It's something
very contrived?
yes, and it's
Mm.
something that this rather hostile servant does.
Oh, right.
I I just oh,
Were
so
you
that
shouting at the screen at that point?
yeah, I was thinking, oh, just could you not have found a different way of doing that?
Yeah.
Something a bit more subtle. Anyway, I didn't like that, but somebody else might think that's a brilliant tour de
Yeah.
force
Yeah.
twist. So I would say that what is nice about Miss Austen is it takes us back to a gentler color palette. We're away from the sort of citruses of the Bridgerton world and the over beauty of the Bridgerton world, in a world of more normal people in period costumes doing things at a more normal level.
Yeah.
And it's thoroughly enjoyable. There's some lovely contrasts between the mourning household
Mm.
and the remembrance of the trip to Lyme Regis
Yeah. Which was
scene.
very nice. Yeah.
Yeah. So I it's worth watching, but sometimes you can enjoy things by shouting at the TV screen.
Yes, indeed.
Thoroughly
No,
enjoying it.
I did like it on the whole, and as you say, it's worth persevering past the first one, which is quite depressing, but it's
Yeah.
meant to be because you're in, somebody's dying, and the niece is basically turfed out of her house, and they're trying to find out who's going to look after her, which is very, very worrying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the review of Miss Austen. I think we're going to have lots of Austen moments during the year.
Oh, yes.
So, on our other Jane news, have you got anything to mention to us?
Yes, it's balls, 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 and more balls throughout this year. Everybody who's anybody is having a ball, and more so than ever before, because what better way to celebrate Jane Austen? Well, there's lots of ways to celebrate Jane Austen, but that's the way that a lot of people come. So I'll put out links on our podcast when I can send them to you, Julia. But just to give you an idea, there's a Buxton Ball in March. There's only a few tickets left for that. There's a Halifax Regency Ball, I think, in June or July. I'll send you the link for that. Tea Dance in York, Leamington Spa Ball, also happening on the 1st of March, I think. And the Jane Austen Festival has put 5 balls, five, everybody, on the first weekend of the festival, and I think they're all sold out within minutes. I think one ball sold out within about 10 minutes of the tickets going on sale.
Oh
Uh,
no!
I
I've
know,
got my
and
ticket.
but the daft thing was they put on 5 balls because they knew that this year was going to be the most crowd gathering year. So I think we had about 2,000 people on the promenade last year. I fully expect that record to be broken this year. So they put extra balls on effectively, and somebody said, "Oh, I don't know why." Online, somebody said, "I don't know why they've put so many balls. I've got to buy 5 tickets now." I said, "No, that's not the idea. The idea is you buy one ticket and leave some for everybody else."
It's
So
going to be like tickets going for inflated prices.
yes, I fully.
Sharp
Maybe they'll
kind of
try to
Lucy
duel over
Field of
them. I
this
don't
world will
know.
be out there sort of flogging her tickets outside.
So my advice to you viewers is don't despair if you can't get a ball at Jane Austen, in Bath. There's loads of balls going on throughout the year. I would definitely try for one of those if you can't get your tickets for Bath.
I've missed the boat on that one. I'm most upset. I've got a little bit of Jane Austen news, which is I've got if you're French, my Jane Austen for children series. There's a nice. They've been in hardback, so this is now the paperback edition, which starts with the wonderfully named Le Fantôme de l'Abbé, Ghost of the Abbey. In English, it's called the Abbey,
Yes, yes,
and the
it does
second
sound
part,
better.
Un voleur au bal, right, ball, which
Excellent.
is Burglar's Ball in
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
yeah. So it's very nice to see those come through. I'm also writing a book which is coming out. Hold your breath, everybody, because this is it's coming out the end of November, which is in my Dora and Jacob series, the Regency Secrets, which is called the Austen Intrigue.
Oh, right.
This will be in
Okay.
time for her birthday. Um,
Excellent. Good timing, Julia.
yeah,
No pressure to finish that then.
yeah, no, I'm really enjoying writing it. I don't. It's one of those
Good.
things where I'm trying not to rush it because it's like a lovely box of chocolates when I'm
Oh,
able
that's
to
nice.
do things with it.
Oh, bless you.
Anyway, so thank you very much for joining me, and I
Oh,
think
oh, I'm going to do a shameless plug,
oh,
by the way,
please.
but this is a shameless plug for a very good cause for our listeners and viewers. Um, Bankfield Museum in Halifax home of Mr. Darcy's wet shirt, as it shall forevermore be known, has actually got that on display with lots and lots of other Regency costumes on the exhibition, which is free costume drama until December this year. So if you want to go and see Mr. Darcy facing off against that lovely curry-coloured Spencer that Elizabeth wears when she's talking to him by the lake, along with Emma's yellow pelisse and Mr. Knightley's gear. Go get yourself up there to Halifax, West Yorkshire, and you won't regret it. It's a wonderful exhibition, and they've got some genuine costume alongside, or historical costume alongside reproductions, but lots of wonderful things to really enjoy there.
We must do an outside broadcast from there.
You should.
I'll sort that out with you. Come up and have a look at them.
Right. You're more than welcome.
So has your honour been satisfied, Katie?
Yes, I think so. I don't think we need to resort to swords.
Okay.
Just don't wear that bonnet again, Julia.
Thank you very much.